Alternative dispute resolution is a well-established tradition, if you will, in the construction industry. And partly this results from the fact that construction projects are long-term. These are the quintessential relational contracts, that is, contracts where both parties are required to perform over an extended period of time. It's not a one-off where you go in, you buy a widget at a department store, take it home. These tend to be long-term projects. Even a relatively modest home renovation project can take weeks. And when you're talking about a large-scale construction project, it may be years in process. And so the construction industry has a lot of experience with resolving disputes. One of the most common ways of resolving construction disputes is through mediation. And mediation is it's something parties have to agree to. They have a dispute, they agree that they're going to resolve it, and they're going to try to resolve it through mediation. What that means is essentially they hire a third party who's a neutral, that is, doesn't have a stake in the outcome, and who's the mediator. The mediator essentially facilitates negotiations between the parties. This is not a binding resolution process. That is, the mediator doesn't have the authority to bind anyone to anything. All the mediator is trying to do is essentially play shuttle diplomat and work with the parties, typically through mediation in a mediation procedure, to see if there's a settlement that can be reached. And so what will usually happen when the parties have not been able to resolve a dispute on their own is they will look for a mediator who can help them have a conversation about whether there's a solution here, whether there's a settlement that can be had. And the mediator will have an agreement that the parties have to sign that sort of lays out how the process is going to work. And mediations can take, from a few hours to a few days, but often start with each side presenting a kind of opening presentation to tell their side of the story. And then it's often the case that the parties will break out into separate caucus rooms, and the mediator spends a lot of the time going from one side to the other, trying to identify exactly what the issues are that are in dispute and whether there's a resolution possible to each of those issues. Now, if you read the literature about mediation, there are really two sort of overall styles. What's called facilitative, which is essentially the mediator trying not to take a position on the merits of anything, but just to get the parties talking and to explore the options and remind them about the costs of litigation if they fail to reach a settlement and so forth, as opposed to more evaluative mediation, where the mediator may tell a party, look, I know you've got these 5 claims, but we all know that the first 2 are really pretty bogus. So, let's not waste a lot of time on those. Let's focus on these other 3 that might have something there. That's more evaluative. And so parties will often, especially repeat players who've been in mediations before, will be looking for one type of mediator versus another, depending on the merits of their own cases. In terms of how it relates to other ADR processes, it's worth noting that very often, especially like in construction contracts, you'll have mediation as a condition precedent to a party being able to go to arbitration or demand arbitration. And so what that means is that this is called stepped or tiered dispute resolution, where in the contract itself, it says, okay, the parties agree first to negotiate, and if that doesn't work, then they'll go to mediation, and if that doesn't work, then they'll go to arbitration or litigation. But often the contract will say, oh, and by the way, participating in mediation for X number of days is a condition precedent to going on to the next step, whether that's binding arbitration or court litigation, as a way of sort of forcing parties to meet and talk and try to resolve their differences. Now, dispute review boards, these are fairly common on particularly large projects, and what they are, essentially, these are creatures of contract, and so you have to look at the contract to see exactly how a given DRB is set up and what authority it has. But generally speaking, what dispute review boards are standing panels of neutrals, say 3 industry experts. They could be lawyers, engineers, some combination of them, who are sort of on standby in the event that a dispute arises. The idea is that and even when there hasn't actually been a dispute yet, the DRB may be asked to just tour the project from time to time to see how things are going, talk to the participants, get familiar with the players. But the idea is that if a dispute arises and there's, it looks like parties are starting to get crosswise with each other before they get really entrenched in their positions, there could be a meeting of the dispute review board to look at the merits and make suggestions, address the issues as they arise. These recommendations are typically not binding on parties, but it's amazing how many times disputes will sort of take care of themselves once one party at least feels like it's been heard and isn't simply being stonewalled by the other. And so dispute review boards are designed to provide sort of interim resolution, or at least recommendations about how disputes might be resolved as they arise, rather than waiting until things really get out of control. Adjudication is similar to a dispute review board, and in fact there are some mechanisms that are called dispute adjudication boards under different forms of construction contracts. Adjudication can be either statutory, as in Ontario, the new Ontario Construction Act provides for statutory adjudication, or it can be a creature of contract where the parties bake into their contract a requirement that disputes, or permission that disputes can be taken to adjudication. And essentially this too is another fast-tracked way of trying to resolve disputes as they arise. And again, it involves using a third-party neutral, usually just one adjudicator, or if you've got 3 of them, then it becomes a dispute adjudication board. But the basic concept is that the adjudicator, or the DAB, the dispute adjudication board, renders decisions that are binding, okay, but only on an interim basis. And what that means is they'll resolve a dispute, and that will be binding on the parties until the end of the project, until the project's finished. And then at the end of the project, people who are not happy with the adjudicator's decision can go back and revisit the merits in a de novo kind of hearing before an arbitrator or a court. And the basic concept behind adjudication is that because so many disputes that arise during the course of a project are about payment, about money, the idea behind adjudication is that parties essentially should pay now and argue later about the merits. And so this tends to be a fairly contractor-friendly concept, and is something that has actually been fairly successful, especially in the UK, in resolving disputes and getting parties to a point where at the end of the project they've either learned to live with the decision or have managed to find some other way short of arbitration or litigation to resolve any outstanding differences. So there are a variety of alternative dispute resolution procedures, mediation, the dispute review boards, adjudication, etc., that are very common in the construction industry. I haven't included arbitration because in some ways arbitration is not really alternative. It's very often what everyone expects the dispute resolution mechanism to be. But these other forms of ADR are important to understand just so that you'll know what you're looking at when you run across this kind of provision in a contract.